Dr. Stanley Sandler. Hello, this is Dr. Stanley Sandler, host of Stan the History Man. Every now and then, every other day or so, a podcast on history. I know a lot of items that you may not be aware of. And one of the things I'd like to talk about, or at least fully aware of, and one of the things I want to talk about now is Vichy France. Now, the background to this is, excuse me, is that, as you know, the Germans defeated France in 6 weeks in May, June 1940. A little footnote here, a lot of people don't realize that between 90 to 100,000 French soldiers died in that campaign. So I figure somebody must have been resisting the Germans. But putting that aside, the Germans, the Nazis, got smart after they defeated France. They said, we're not going to take over the whole country. We, Untermenschen, subhuman. As a matter of fact, as you may know, Hitler made a grand tour of Paris, because Hitler was, of course, an architectural student, so he knew there's a lot of good architecture in Paris. So what they did was they occupied about half of France, eastern France, and the area pertaining to the English Channel. Of course, they were at war with England, so they wanted to defend that area, have troops stationed there. But southern France, southern and eastern France, that would be under what they call the Vichy Regime. And that was the French government set up under German auspices, a government in the spa town of Vichy. It's a town where people would go to for the cure, good mineral baths and that type of thing. And they had a lot of hotels. So the government new government under Marshal Pétain, the great hero of World War I, the Great War, was the president. Now, Pétain was revered by the French because he had at Verdun, when it looked like France might fall, ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass, and they didn't at Verdun. So he was a revered figure. So when the Vichy government was set up, he was revered. There were portraits of the aged marshal all over the place, and Pétain liked this. He was a vain old man. So anyway, this was a government which was nominally independent. French law applied in Vichy France. And to show how, in a way, how independent they were, the Nazis, being Nazis, sent spies in to Vichy just to keep an eye on things. And when the French Sûreté, the French security forces, captured some of them, they had them shot because this is wartime. And the Germans, I think the French said, "You don't mind, do you?" And the Germans said, "No, this is wartime. We're still officially at war, and a spy caught in wartime is going to be shot." So, at any rate, Vichy, under increasing German pressure, became increasingly anti-Semitic, for example. And this is the great thing that's being held against Vichy. You could argue, well, they were dominated by the Germans, and there wasn't a lot they could do. But their rounding up of the Jews was far more, I think, than was more enthusiastic almost. They really almost say enthusiastic. And this tapped into a French underlying anti-Semitism. And France is somewhat unique this way. They can be somewhat unique, but there was an intellectual bedrock to anti-Semitism under French philosophers like Basiloch. They weren't the front rank of philosophers, but still they were respectable. They were strongly anti-Semitic. So a lot of there was some intellectual support for the Vichy government, and increasingly the government rounded up the Jews. All they could get, the Germans said, you got to round them up, and so they did. Also, as resistance increased, both in Vichy and the rest of France, the Pétain Vichy regime was very enthusiastic in rounding them up, and their counterinsurgency force, the milice, militia, was very brutal. They hired both thugs. I think they opened the jails to hire people to wear the milice beret. And a lot of underground said, we prefer the Germans to the milice. So there are a lot of hatred, a lot of massacres here. And of course, the milice were massacred as well. Well, on June 6th, as you know, 1944, the Allies landed in France and started to push inland slowly. And so the Vichy government also had to retreat. By the way, I would say officially Vichy ended when the Allies invaded North Africa in November of 1942. But still, it was kind of a shadowy existence. The German forces rolled into the rest of France to Vichy, but they still allowed Pétain had a certain amount of power. The Prime Minister, Pierre Laval, also. Laval was really a thuggish character. He really was going to pay for it after the war. So they retreated with the Germans, and when Germany surrendered, of course, then Pétain rather dignifiedly presented himself to the Allied authorities and said, "I am Marshal Pétain. Do you have any business with me?" So right away they arrested him, and the post-war de Gaulle government put him on trial, and Marshal Laval and other characters like the leader of the milice and people like that, and some are pretty scruffy characters. But Pétain, of course, had that image of being a hero, and well, first of all, Prime Minister Laval, Pierre Laval, was basically frog marched out the nearest post and shot after a farcical trial. Now, as were some of the other heads of Vichy, but Pétain himself was tried. It wasn't quite such a farcical trial, a little more dignified, and he was condemned to death also. But Prime Minister de Gaulle, who had the interim government in France at the time, he alleviated death sentence because of Pétain's services in the First World War, the Great War. And so he was sentenced to life imprisonment. And so he spent the last years of his life, he died in 1951, increasingly in his dotage, and then died at the Isle d'Yeu, a fortified island in France, in July or August 1951, bringing to an end to the Vichy, well, not the regime, but actors in the Vichy regime. It's still very controversial in France. Many people say that, well, Pétain had no choice. He had to collaborate with the Germans, and that, of course, was Pétain's defense, too. I'm a loyal Frenchman, but I have to save my country. Others say you should have been so enthusiastic about rounding up the Jews and so brutal in putting down the underground, which is called the Maquis, les Maquis, at the time. So France was really riven. It was in terrible shock. I mean, the French army, we don't realize now, Churchill's before the war said, thank God for the French army. And so it was a terrible shock for that army to be so badly defeated. And sometimes people, well, the equipment there was old fashioned. No, the French tanks were every bit as good as German tanks, in some respects better. The Char B, the Renault tanks. The one thing they didn't have the radios in their tanks, so they couldn't be maneuvered from the air the way the German tanks could be. But I mean, they were not that inferior in equipment. Okay, so it wasn't just that. So why were we defeated? And we can go into that in another talk. But as of now, the shock was great. This mighty French army was ignominiously defeated. And maybe ignominious is too strong. I say there's 100,000 French dead soldiers. I mean, somebody must have been fighting. Nonetheless, it was a terrible shock. And you can't say they really went down fighting. So the Vichy regime was sort of a solace at the time for their terrible defeat. Well, Marshal Pétain, he'll take good care of us. But then as time went on, became more and more unpopular. So it's still debated among French and Allied, American and British and Canadian historians about the place of Vichy in history. But isn't that like almost every event in history? There's always a lot of debates about it. Well, thank you. This is Dr. Sandler, another episode of Stan the History Man. I'll talk with you later. Bye-bye.